So it's a great pleasure to be here today, and I wish to talk to you about the idea of decolonizing technosignatures. This is an ongoing work that's being built up over the past few years. And I want to tell you about this through an Indigenous lens. Myself, while I am a professor at Memorial University of Newfoundland, Labrador, I'm also a Mi'kmaq person, and I have a strong focus on thinking about Indigenous methodologies in Western sciences. And so in that kind of framework, I wish to talk to you about how we can think about decolonizing technosignatures through that lens. Also, I want to note that when we talk about decolonizing, it is a critical methodology of looking at something, and therefore it depends a lot on experiences and locations. For some people, decolonization might mean a very different thing. So primarily when I talk about decolonizing, I'm thinking about this through a North American or Canadian lens. Further, following works by scholars such as Tuck and Yang, decolonization gets used a lot in a metaphorical sense. And in some respects, I'm doing that here. So some of this is mostly looking at how we have a colonial view, colonial lens in terms of technosignatures. And thinking about the decolonization is not necessarily the same as, say, land back for Indigenous folks in Canada and the US. So to help with this discussion, I want to talk a little bit about how we can think about science through Indigenous methodologies. Maybe this is a bit of a review for some of you, and I think Catherine actually kind of highlighted some of these ideas in her talk. But it's worth noting that being myself in Canada, many of you may be in the United States, Indigenous peoples have been on the land since time immemorial. And as such, being on land since time immemorial means building strong, deep relationships with the natural world around you. And no matter where we go, for instance, where I am in Canada, I'm on the eastern tip of Canada, was Martha's Beothuk territory. And no matter where you step on what we call Canada or the US, or anywhere in the Americas, or Australia, or Eritrea, and so on, Indigenous peoples have lived since time immemorial. That means living in relationship with land, water, animals, air, and the night. And that builds a direct science. And so many scholars, Daniel Laipe, Marie Baptiste, Gregor Cajete, have discussed and built up models of how Indigenous folks can kind of view science in their own ways. So something that's not the traditional scientific method. And for many of this, Indigenous knowledge is, you think of it as maybe axioms or whatever. What is it we see in the sky as a reflection below? When we tell stories of the night sky, they're largely a reflection of where we are in the land. If I'm telling a story of a great bear, I'm talking about where I am in Taramguk or in Mi'kma'ki. If a colleague is telling a story of a same constellation that is, say, a caribou, they may be in the Arctic. And so what we see in the sky is a reflection of ourselves. For many Indigenous peoples, knowledge is relational. For Western science, traditionally, knowledge is an objective, is something we aim to create. And that creation is the goal upon itself. For Indigenous peoples, having knowledge, it goes with responsibility for how you use it and how you share it. And that knowledge has to be in relationship with kin and land, water, and so on. For many Indigenous peoples, we think of multiple variables interacting concurrently, whereas which may be kind of opposed to, say, Occam's razor of the smallest number of variables, but thinking about how the variables interact as a whole and looking beyond the average. Knowledge is holistic. We don't think of the idea of SETI is very interdisciplinary. But to have an interdisciplinary field means we have to set up the fields as disciplines first. For Indigenous peoples, knowledge doesn't exist in these disciplines. Talking about astronomy is talking about biology, is talking about ethics, and so on. But most importantly, and I think is something to think about when we go through type of technosignatures, is that nature is familial. Many First Nation peoples and First Nation communities have clan systems, and those clans are reflective of different animals that generate those animals being kin and being in relations. So nature is equal to us. Nature is something we live with and have to support in such ways that for many Indigenous peoples, what we do in nature comes with responsibilities, not just rights. We could talk about this in terms of treaty, for instance. In Canada and the U.S., many First Nation peoples have treaties with the government, whether it's U.S. government or the Crown in Canada. But you can also have treaties with the animals, with the deer, with bear, with salmon. And those treaties outline rights and responsibilities as equal partners. And so, in this respect, thinking about intelligence and thinking about whose technosignatures is also means coming from means considering non-human perspectives. But it's worth noting there's no such thing as a pan-Indigenous knowledge system. There are Mi'kmaq knowledges, Salish knowledges, Navajo knowledges, but they may have a lot in common, but there's no whole overarching system. And the importance of that is to think about, well, when we're coming up with technosignatures, how does it relate to these knowledge systems? Well, furthermore, I would take it this way, that if we embrace these Indigenous knowledges along with our Western science and technosignatures, we will be better scientists for it. This is a framework called two-eyed seeing from Albert Marshall. And in this idea, one lens is a view of Western science. The other lens is Indigenous knowledges. And when you bring the two together, you get a deeper, more profound view of nature. And I would argue the way we think of technosignatures today has largely been from the one lens of Western science or Western techno societies. And we can compare then the difference between Indigenous knowledges on the left with some statements around traditional Western science on the right, mostly taken from Daniel Laipe's work in 2017. Knowledge relational versus knowledge is objective. Knowledge is discipline versus knowledge is hierarchical. Knowledge is holistic, sorry. Nature is familiar versus nature is a hierarchy. And we see how nature is a hierarchy and how we operate on Earth. We pollute waters. Humans have caused the extinction of numerous species, innumerable species. We have driven climate change and are forcing other species to begin to adapt to how we are living poorly on these lands. So these relate to how we could talk about technosignatures, because when we think of technosignatures, I'm sure we've had a whole lot of discussion on that. So it's kind of silly to say what they are, but I kind of view them from two senses. One, they are deviations from nature. I believe Professor Seeger in her talk noted, looking for fluorine compounds because they are the least naturally occurring biological and chemical signatures, so therefore they're more robust. Apologies if I got that wrong. But these technosignatures are so much about being deviations from chemistry and traditional biology, at least as we understand those fields. But it's also about scale. We can't point the JWST at an exoplanet system and see a candle burning in a window on another planet. Maybe we could see a whole planet burning, but we cannot see the candle. And so when we look for technosignatures, we also have to look for a signal that is robust enough to stand out and therefore requires significant scales. And in that respect, we sort of have a sense of what kind of technosignatures we've been looking for, from originally radio to the Dyson spheres, to light pollution, to cell phone radio signals, climate change, maybe nuclear reactions, explosions. But in other words, we're looking at the impacts from things we know in Western civilizations. And if that's the case, we're really looking at a colonial civilization. And the key for that detection then is, what is the impact of the technology on nature? For instance, a Dyson sphere is about removing the radiation of the host star. Climate change about deviating from a traditional biological atmosphere to something very different. Light pollution is artificial radiation. And if these are just deviations then from natural signals and processes, how does that work in an Indigenous knowledge system that seeks nature as familial? That doesn't mean there's no such thing as pollution in Indigenous communities or there's no such thing as technosignatures, but it means that what we do in technosignatures comes with responsibilities and so finding ways to support natural kin, whether it's animal, water, plants, even earth. So how do this work in this situation? For the most part, though, I think this leads to the problem that technosignatures are solely or have been pollution. Because a deviation from a natural order or a natural system is a form of pollution that is dangerous. And that's what we're looking for in these artificial signals, primarily, in my opinion. But my colleague Max Liboiron wrote a very wonderful book a few years ago, Pollution is Colonialism. In Max's work, using various Métis or Michif Indigenous lenses, discussed about things around microplastics in the ocean, how the plastics impact fish stocks and things like, and the abilities for communities to work, particularly in small communities around Atlantic Canada. And noting in this that the idea of microplastics in the ocean creating these islands both do various different things. One, it forms pollution that damages the life cycles of various animals. But in some cases, they can also form a small ecosystem that some beings can build around. But in the end, what we see is this pollution is being driven against the lands and the ways of being of what these lands were originally, pre-colonial colonial times. And in that respect, then pollution is colonialism. And this, in a sense, does that mean that technosignatures are colonial in nature? I know perhaps I'm sort of discussing this in a way that Stephen Hawking talked about the messaging extraterrestrials being bad because they'll do to us what was done in the Americas, in that the sense that extraterrestrial life is colonial. But in some respect, perhaps some of it is. If we have these technosignatures where we're looking for very much deviations from nature at large scales, then are we looking for expansionist civilizations? Are we looking for exploitative civilizations? And in that respect, then are we looking for something that looks like a Western civilization that is colonial? And so we should be asking whether these technosignatures themselves are colonialism. So, and pretty much it was just about my last slide, is thinking about how we decolonize these technosignatures. This is a very challenging question because being trained in Western astronomy, the idea of looking for signals is very much the artificial, whether it's the narrowband radio, whether it is the Dyson sphere blocking light or whatever. But instead, if we go back to these indigenous methodologies about nature being familial and living with responsibilities, then maybe technology would operate to to help support an ecosystem that is natural, and not even just natural, but more of itself. Nature enhanced, and not enhanced in an artificial way, but enhanced and as being supported and nurtured and working together. Could a technosignature be a biosignature that is beyond what you would expect without a active participant working in that nature? Or I don't want to use it's awkward to say this because I end up wanting to say like a super biological signature, but thinking about how we can have technosignatures that support nature, that support other non-human, or in this case, the non-intelligent or the non-technological species and beings on those other worlds. Perhaps a Dyson sphere can fall into that, except a Dyson sphere requires raw materials, which maybe you take from an entire solar system, in which case we deny the life and the rights, perhaps, of other worlds. Because part of these living in nature is not just within the planet itself or under a certain altitude, but also in relationship with satellites, with other planets in a solar system, with comets in a solar system, and even the host star. So, maybe this means we should be thinking about how we think about the scale of technosignatures as being ones that support a solar system as much as build for the dominant species. So what do these signatures, technologies that support nature do? Are there enhanced biosignatures or enhanced chemical signatures that are natural that we can focus on and think about as being these technosignatures? Now, this might be hard to do because, as noted previously, biosignatures are highly disputable, and this would just fall into that much into that category. But I think we should be thinking beyond of that. The technosignatures we're currently looking for are very limited in scope. That if we're looking for technosignatures built on Western civilization technologies, they may be rare because of things we see in the Fermi Paradox, such as the Great Filter and the fact that civilizations might destroy themselves. Because, if you're constantly building technology to survive, then you're kind of fighting against your own self, particularly when you're doing it at larger and larger scales. But if we're supporting nature, then these signals may be longer lasting, albeit far more challenging to detect. So with that, I'll thank you for your time.